If the Nazis had won World War II, the world as we know it today would not even be a shadow of what it is. The Holocaust, which at that time had already taken millions of lives, would probably have extended even further, and without a doubt, the Nazi ideology, based on the superiority of the Aryan race, would have imposed a new world order. All of this is mere speculation. We will never know the path Hitler might have taken. We can only speculate based on his actions as recorded in history. Nevertheless, the victory of the Allies prevented this scenario in which we would have been entangled and allowed for the reconstruction of Europe, establishing a world order that, to this day, is based on the principles of democracy and human rights. Origin of the conflict. The conflict erupted in 1939 with the invasion of Poland by Hitler's troops, but its origins trace further back to the Treaty of Versailles, signed 20 years earlier, where the victorious powers of World War I imposed intolerable conditions on Germany, which the majority of the German population never accepted. The fact that some German regions were militarily controlled by the victorious powers, or that Germany had to pay reparations, was not as painful as the requirement for Germany to accept sole responsibility for the outbreak of the war. This was always considered by the Germans as an injustice that would one day be avenged. Thus, the obligation for Germans to pay war reparations prevented the country from stabilizing economically. In a landscape filled with strikes, work stoppages and inflation, the disillusioned German population turned their gaze toward those offering radical solutions to end this state of permanent political instability, where the National Socialists presented themselves as a reliable alternative for Germans. Hitler assumes power. Seeing the instability of the Weimar Republic, Hitler, with his small Nazi party, began his strategy to take power in Germany. After a series of historical missteps like the failed coup of 1923, Hitler decided to change his strategy, thus taking advantage of the Democratic Party system of the Weimar Republic to gain power. He would achieve this goal 10 years after that failed coup, utilizing innovative and effective propaganda, coupled with the climate of coercion created by his followers, who did not hesitate to use intimidation and even physical aggression. Hitler secured electoral results that allowed him to demand the chancellorship from President Paul von Hindenburg. Upon receiving his appointment as chancellor on January 30, 1933, Hitler set his plan in motion to create his totalitarian state. General Erich Ludendorff, who knew Hitler well, wrote a letter to Hindenburg, holding him responsible for what would happen to Germany in the future, asserting in this message that Hitler, that disastrous man, will lead our country to an abyss and our nation to unimaginable disaster. This prophecy would indeed come true years later. Once in power, Hitler set about outlawing the Communist Party and stripping it of all seats in the Reichstag. He also created the Dachau concentration camp for those who opposed his rule, revealing his true face of terror. Hitler's intentions became definitively clear in October 1933 when Germany withdrew from the League of Nations. Furthermore, he reinstated compulsory military service in March 1935, violating the Treaty of Versailles, and acknowledged the existence of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. That same year, the Nuremberg Laws, anti-Semitic decrees, were introduced, practically declaring civil death for all Jews. Though physical elimination was not yet openly discussed, these laws laid the groundwork for future genocide. After reclaiming the Saar region through a plebiscite, Hitler also called a referendum, achieving 99% of the votes. Despite all this, none of the countries yet considered the Third Reich a threat to world peace. This situation allowed Hitler to initiate a widespread rearmament without concern for the limitations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, as Western powers did not intervene. The British even reached an agreement with Nazi Germany, allowing it to build a war fleet, provided it maintained the Royal Navy's superiority. Hitler and German expansion. In March 1936, with only 4 battalions, the Germans entered the Rhineland, an industrial region bordering France that had been demilitarized since the end of World War I. Hitler succeeded and surprisingly invaded the area, scoring another triumph before the German people, who watched with satisfaction as the Führer avenged all the humiliations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. In September 1938, Fueled by his thirst for power, Hitler demanded the annexation of the Czechoslovak region of the Sudetenland, claiming that most of its inhabitants were of German origin. The small country, which at that time had a significant arms industry and a ready-to-fight army, chose to seek advice and aid from France and Britain in response to German threats. However, rather than ensuring its independence, these two powers attempted to convince the Czechs to be reasonable to avoid escalating tensions in Europe. But when Western powers realized that Hitler was willing to go to war to achieve his goals, they decided to meet with the German dictator and accepted Mussolini's offer to mediate. The night of September 29th to 30th, 1938 in Munich, the Democratic powers' capitulation to Hitler's ambitions was sealed. The representative from Czechoslovakia was barred from the negotiation room, and it was decided to dismantle the country to appease Hitler, leading to German troops invading Czechoslovakian territory on October 1st of that year, under the terms of the Munich Pact, taking over the Sudetenland and reaffirming the Third Reich's expansionist stance. Beginning of World War II. Once Hitler's territorial momentum began, he would not turn back, now focusing on Poland, specifically the ancient German city of Danzig, which had become Polish territory since the end of World War I, becoming Germany's justification for further territorial expansion. Danzig was in a corridor linking central Poland with the Baltic Sea, splitting Prussian territory in two. The German dictator sought to exploit the grievances from the Treaty of Versailles to justify his actions, and Danzig was the perfect excuse, bolstering Hitler's standing among the German people and reaffirming his leadership. On March 26, 1939, he demanded Danzig's handover. But the Poles, mindful of what happened to the Czechs, secured a guarantee of aid from Britain, which France later joined. Hitler also skillfully moved his pieces. On May 22, 1939, he signed the Pact of Steel with Mussolini, whereby both nations committed to mutual support. Alliances were beginning to take shape on the European stage, foreshadowing the onset of a future conflict. After achieving this, Hitler continued his strategy, surprising everyone, especially European communist parties, when on August 23, 1939, a pact was signed in the Kremlin between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. This was, in reality, a collaboration agreement that would hold literally until the early hours of June 22, 1941, when Hitler launched his troops against the USSR. However, there was still time for a final diplomatic move. Outwardly, Hitler's aim was only to return Danzig to the Reich's territory, but his true intention was to seize Poland. But to achieve this, he needed to neutralize the Soviet Union to prevent it from perceiving the invasion as a threat to its borders, and there was no better way to achieve this than by offering the Soviets part of Poland. There was another side effect. The hypothetical German-Soviet pact was intended to force Britain out of the picture. The London government had guaranteed support to Warsaw in the event of a German attack, but the prospect of also facing the Russians if they honored this promise would inevitably cool this intention. Hitler knew Stalin could not be deceived in the same way he had done with Daladier in Munich. In April 1939, Hitler began to approach the Soviet Union, although bridges between Berlin and Moscow had already been established since January of that year. The German ambassador in the Russian capital informed the Soviets that Hitler was willing to negotiate an agreement that would involve a division of influence in Eastern Europe. On May 3rd, Stalin decided to replace his foreign minister Litvinov, who favored a European peace policy and an agreement with the British and French, with Vyacheslav Molotov. The new minister was a Russian of Finnish descent, originally named Skrjabin, who had changed his name to the proletarian nickname Molotov. Ribbentrop and Molotov would be responsible for signing the pact between their respective countries on August 23, 1939, in the Kremlin, in Stalin's presence. The meeting concluded, as expected, with the endless toasts to which the Russians were so accustomed. Once again, Hitler's maneuver did not receive the attention it deserved. For example, the French, with Édouard Daladier as head of government, believed they had the best army in the world and fully trusted their chief general, Maurice Gamelin, to handle any eventuality. The British, led by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, still trusted that Hitler would not drag Europe into war, The only one who then warned of the dangers of this understanding between the two totalitarian empires was Winston Churchill. Upon learning of this move by Hitler, German propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels worked hard to shift the narrative about the Soviet Union. Joseph Goebbels was a German politician with a solid academic background. After failing in journalism and literature, he became head of party propaganda in 1928 and propaganda minister in 1933 until his death. He was a true master of deceit and manipulation. One of his most famous contributions is the assertion, "A lie repeated 100 times becomes truth." Thus, until that date, Bolshevism, alongside Judaism, was considered responsible for all the ills threatening Germany. From August 23, 1939, Stalin's Russia would no longer be demonized by the press, firmly controlled by Goebbels. Some newspaper editors who just days earlier wrote hysterically about the Bolshevik threat now described the Soviets as old friends under this new perspective. However, this German-Soviet pact represented the triumph of state policy over ideologies, as two ideological enemies reached an agreement. It cannot be overlooked that this pact was signed by two totalitarian men who indeed had much in common in that regard. Following this event, the invasion of Poland began on September 1, 1939. At 4:45 in the early hours of that dark Friday, German troops crossed the Polish border. According to the plan approved by the General Staff, the German armies were divided into two army groups, the main one in the south, commanded by General Gerd von Rundstedt, and a second group in the north, led by General Fedor von Bock. The entire operation was under the command of General Walter von Brauchitsch. The German plan was to attack Poland from three flanks, from the north through East Prussia, cutting through the corridor and surrounding the ancient German city of Danzig, where the German population would overpower the weak Polish garrison, from the west through West Prussia, and from the south starting from Silesia and Slovakia. The first two advances would be conducted by the army group in the north, and the third by the southern group. The German battleship Schleswig-Holstein bombarded Polish forces protecting the port of Gdynia at the start of the operations, in the corridor opening to the Baltic Sea, the gateway to Danzig. By nightfall on the first day of the war, the disputed Danzig was already in German hands. Only the Westerplatte fortification, which would resist for a week, remained. Hitler did not halt the offensive upon achieving his claim to the city, which until then belonged to the Poles. From the outset, it was clear that the difference between the two armies was immense. Although the Poles had 30 active divisions and the Germans 40, Hitler's troops were vastly superior, possessing several armoured and motorised divisions. Conversely, the Poles had only a dozen cavalry brigades, only one of which was motorised. They had only 600 armoured vehicles to oppose the Germans' 3,200. The disparity extended to the air. While the Polish Air Force had 842 outdated aircraft, the modern Luftwaffe had 3,234 planes. On the second day of fighting, Saturday, September 2, 1939, the British presented an ultimatum to Germany demanding a withdrawal from Poland, while France, fearful of a German reaction they were unprepared for, merely requested a withdrawal with the aim of reaching a Munich-like agreement. With Germany refusing to withdraw its army, Great Britain declared war at 11 a.m. on Sunday, September 3rd. France reluctantly followed suit 6 hours later. This was the official outbreak of World War II. At that moment, time was now against everyone. The Germans needed to overcome Polish resistance before the latter could receive support from their allies. Thus, the British and French had to mobilize quickly to act before the Wehrmacht defeated the Polish forces. Finally, the Poles had to resist however they could to allow time for help from their allies to arrive. The German army enjoyed the most favourable position in this particular race. Their tanks sped through the Polish plains, while Stuka aircraft sowed chaos among Polish communications. Their dive bombing terrified both soldiers and civilians alike. When the descent began, an automatic siren emitted a piercing sound, signalling imminent death. Within a week, German troops were already threatening Warsaw. By September 6th, Krakow had fallen, and now the capital faced the German army. The encirclement of Warsaw was completed on September 8th, and the decisive battle began the next day. The Poles attempted a counter-offensive in Poznan, to alleviate the pressure on the capital. This maneuver met with some success, leading the Polish government to believe that Warsaw might withstand the siege, but it was not to be. On September 17th, the Soviet army crossed the eastern Polish border. The Poles had no organized forces to protect the border, and the Russians advanced almost unopposed, suffering only 700 casualties. Stalin thus came to claim his share of Poland, as agreed with the Germans in the secret pact signed on August 23rd. The Soviet government's excuse for invading eastern Poland was to protect Ukrainians and Belarusians living in those regions due to the collapse of the Polish administration following the German invasion. According to the Soviets, this administration could no longer ensure the safety of its citizens. The Red Army quickly reached its objectives, thanks to its superior forces and the redeployment of Polish troops westward to confront the open front with the Germans. Between 230,000 and 950,000 Polish soldiers were taken as prisoners of war. The Moscow government annexed the new territory, bringing it under Soviet control and declaring that Polish citizens in the annexed zone, over 13 million people, were now Soviet citizens. The day after the attack, on September 18th, the Polish government fled to Romania. The final obstacle for Hitler's troops in seizing Poland was the capture of Warsaw, which was well defended by a ring of fortifications. The Polish capital heroically withstood the brutal Luftwaffe bombings for 9 more days, but by September 27th, white flags began to appear in the windows. Warsaw was forced to surrender. On September 28th, the city of Thorn, the last stronghold of Polish resistance, fell. On that day, the Act of Capitulation was signed. The Polish campaign lasted only 28 days, during which more than 150,000 Polish lives were lost, including soldiers and civilian bombing victims. Meanwhile, Great Britain and France were at war with Germany. Just as at the beginning of World War I, the first successes belonged exclusively to the Germans. On Sunday, September 3rd, the day of the war declaration, the U-30 submarine sank the British liner Athenia, killing 1,900 passengers, presumably mistaking it for a Corsair merchant. Hitler now had his mind set on the next step in his project to extend German hegemony across the continent. He was determined to launch an offensive in the west to reach Paris and achieve what the Kaiser's armies had failed to accomplish in 1914 when they were stopped at the Marne in their advance on the French capital. The date chosen for the start of the Western campaign was January 17, 1940. Although his generals considered winter not the best time for a broad offensive, Hitler was eager to defeat France. He knew that his enemy's military capability was superior, but the heavy French military machine required a long time to mobilize. In contrast, the Wehrmacht was much more agile and already well prepared, as demonstrated in Poland, making it necessary to act quickly to capitalize on this advantage. However, a chance incident disrupted all of the Führer's plans. A week before the planned invasion, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 aircraft flew near the Belgian border. On board were 2 officers transporting the highly secret offensive plans, and they were forced to make an emergency landing on Belgian soil. The Belgian army learned of these plans, forcing Hitler to postpone the invasion of France until spring. While Hitler worried about the Western Front due to the revelation of his plans, a small army in the east was heroically resisting the assaults of the Soviet giant. Once Poland was divided and shared, the Russians sought to add more territories to the Soviet Union. Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania had already been annexed under the secret agreement with the Nazis. Emboldened by these successes achieved with little effort, Stalin set his sights on proud Finland, fiercely protective of its independence. To secure and expand its access to the Baltic, a Finnish delegation was summoned to the Kremlin on October 14, 1939, to negotiate a border adjustment in Russia's favor. The border was to be moved 25 kilometers back from Leningrad, and the Finns were to allow the establishment of a Soviet naval base on the Hanko Peninsula. In exchange, Moscow offered an area in Karelia twice as large, but of far less economic and strategic importance. After a month of endless sessions in which compensation alternated with threats, the Finnish diplomats ultimately rejected the proposal. On November 26th, the Russians staged an incident. Soviet artillery attacked several areas near the Russian village of Mainila, later claiming that the attack came from the Finns and that several Soviet soldiers had died. Supported by this ruse, the Soviets again demanded that Finland pull back its troops 25 kilometers from the border and apologize for the incident. Finland denied involvement and refused to apologize. The Soviet Union then declared that the Non-Aggression Pact of 1934 was no longer in effect. Without a formal declaration of war, the Red Army attacked Finland on November 30, 1939, marking the beginning of the so-called Winter War. Unlike the Poles, the Finns retreated to a solid 130-kilometer-long defensive line, the Mannerheim Line, from which they prepared to repel the Russians, who had entered their country with 23 divisions, totaling 450,000 men. In the narrow strip of occupied Finnish territory, a Soviet puppet government was established on December 1st, with Otto Kuusinen as the head of the new state, the Democratic Republic of Finland. Meanwhile, the Soviet attack on Finland drew the attention of the warring powers to the Scandinavian theatre. Although Hitler preferred to focus all efforts on the imminent Western campaign with France, Norway was emerging as the next source of friction. To fuel its war industry, Germany needed Swedish iron ore. Additionally, for its navy to access the North Sea and the Atlantic, it was essential to keep routes near Norway's coast clear. While Norway remained strictly neutral, Germany enjoyed these advantages. However, it was evident that if Norway fell into the Allies' sphere, Germany would be severely affected. Norway's strategic position did not go unnoticed by the British, who planned to occupy it to prevent it from falling into German hands. Moreover, should they proceed with this plan, it would draw Germany into fighting in the Scandinavian regions, diverting Hitler from his Western ambitions. The French were most interested in opening a front in Norway. President Paul Reynaud, who had replaced Daladier, went to London on March 28 to urge the launch of the operation. While the British were preparing, the Germans outpaced their adversaries. On April 9, 1940, German troops landed at several points along the Norwegian coast, such as Trondheim, Narvik, and Oslo. For the first time in military history, paratroopers were used. Some captured 2 airfields by surprise, while others helped take the capital. Again, the Germans demonstrated that their tactics were the most modern and revolutionary, contrasting sharply with the outdated movements of their enemies. On the same day, the Wehrmacht entered Denmark to use it as an air-naval base to support the forces participating in the invasion of Norway. The Danish population, first with bewilderment and amazement and then with resignation, watched as troops from the neighboring country entered. Before the day ended, King Christian X had ordered the end of Danish resistance, limited to a few futile shots against such a powerful enemy. The fall of Nazi Germany. On May 10th, while the Allied Expeditionary Force was holding out in Narvik, news arrived in Norway that Hitler had launched his offensive in the west, attacking Holland, Belgium and Luxembourg. The maneuver to divert German ambitions to the north had served no purpose. The duel between Germany and the Allies would be decided on the French border. In light of the monumental challenge ahead, Churchill was tasked with forming a government, replacing Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain on that very day. France's call for help meant an immediate request for the return of Allied troops stationed in Norway to repel the invasion of their country. In the midst of this, the Allies withdrew from Narvik 2 weeks later, leaving it to Germany. In 1940, Germany decided to invade the United Kingdom in what became known as Operation Sea Lion. However, they did not fare as well, as they could not overcome the British Navy. Hitler, as a strategist, thought he might have a chance if they could overpower the British in air combat, focusing on bombing English cities and airfields, but it had no lasting effect. The British launched their counterattack and bombed Berlin. Although this confrontation lasted more than 5 months, the Luftwaffe was ultimately contained by the British, who maintained control of the English Channel with their navy. Adolf Hitler's Blitz caused thousands of deaths and widespread destruction on British soil, but his goals were not achieved, marking this as a defeat for the Germans, forcing Hitler to seek or reorganize his strategy, thereby ending the invasion on British soil. Had the British not resisted the German attack, history would be different, as the Germans would have been stronger in facing the Russians in Operation Barbarossa, launched in 1941. With the British subdued, the Führer's army would undoubtedly have had greater capacity to confront the Soviets, taking Stalingrad and subsequently other territories, thus securing control of vital resources to continue his expansionist vision. Fortunately, on June 22nd, when the Germans launched their invasion of the Soviet Union, it resulted in a significant defeat for the Germans on Soviet soil, delivering a severe blow to the Germans. From that moment, the downfall of Hitler's expansionist empire began, ending with the capture of Berlin and its handover to the Allied forces on May 2, 1945. Anti-Semitism. If France and Great Britain were ultimately responsible, through inaction, for Hitler's rise, the German people were also equally accountable. The majority of Germans watched indifferently as citizens of Jewish origin, doctors, teachers, or civil servants who had practiced their professions normally until then, suddenly found themselves unable to continue working. The same happened to Jewish merchants, forced to close their shops, while the rest of the Germans looked away, thinking that the madness they allowed would not affect them. Undoubtedly, the war made the Holocaust a real possibility. The Wehrmacht's victories first put millions of Jews under German control, and Hitler entrusted the task to the SS, led by Heinrich Himmler and his subordinate Reinhard Heydrich, with the aim of exterminating them in cold blood. As early as 1939, the so-called euthanasia program had begun, directly under Hitler and the Führer's chancellery, aimed at eliminating Germans deemed unfit to live because they were physically or mentally abnormal. This program proved to be a testing ground for the final solution. At the end of 1941, the personnel, infrastructure, and expertise in using poisonous gas were transferred to the extermination camps in Poland to use them against the Jews. The massive, industrialized killings carried out in extermination camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka were unprecedented in history. Meanwhile, in Russia, Eastern Europe, and the Balkans, Germans and their collaborators also murdered millions of Jews using more primitive and archaic methods. The Einsatzgruppen and police battalions hunted Jews and executed them in horrific mass killings in pits, forests, ravines, and trenches. Although the Russian, Polish, Serbian, and Ukrainian populations were not condemned to systematic mass murder, they also suffered enormous losses, and 3 million Soviet prisoners of war died during captivity under the Germans. Thus, if Hitler had succeeded in advancing his ethnic cleansing, the Jewish people would have been exterminated throughout Europe, destined to live isolated in concentration camps, forced to work as cheap labor for Hitler's interests. Between 1941 and 1944, German authorities deported nearly 3 million Jews from Germany, the occupied territories, and some Axis allies to extermination centers, where they were murdered using gas chambers built for this infamous purpose.